Thank you everybody for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've actually done a couple of these with Ron, and he always puts together such great content. And so, all credit due to Ron for putting together such great information across all the speakers. My name is Greg O'Hare. I'm one of the sales engineers at CloudHealth by VMware. And really what I want to talk about today is a little bit more about the cloud management from a financial aspect. So we've talked a lot about security, we've talked about some of the deployment, and I know going forward there's going to be more discussions in depth about that. So what I want to talk more about specifically is, when we're building out these cloud center of excellence areas, which is kind of the capstone of how you want to start deploying, how you want to start managing, how to keep everything in line financially. It's really about creating commonality of language across your different departments, and we look at things through kind of three phases of maturity when it comes to cloud. And the first is the security and compliance. That's kind of the foundational one, and that's kind of what Ron had talked to earlier. Then there's the operations, which is where services like Trilio and whatnot can come in. And then financial management, which is one of the pieces that I'm going to work for. And it kind of spans the steps of visibility, optimization, governance and automation, and then business integration into your other KPIs. And this is kind of how CloudHealth views things in how we try to help our customers manage their cloud infrastructure. So we usually find there's a little bit of a disparity, I'll be polite, between the ideas of what finance has and what the ideas of app teams and cloud ops has in terms of what needs to be done. And it's really hitting that central spot of this Venn diagram to really determine, specifically when we talk about Kubernetes, how are we going to connect the dots between what needs to be developed, what is released, and then how it's managed and how it's costing us, right? As a company, what kind of things can we do to get insight? Because often a lot of the different programs and services that are out there, a lot of the native tooling that's out there is really a little bit more through the lens of the development side and the engineering side of things, where you can see how much of each resource is used, but there isn't really that connection to the costing. And that's a lot of what CloudHealth can bring, is we can map the cost elements to the actual infrastructure underneath to give you better insight into what an app is actually costing, what a project is actually costing, how much is that cluster or that pod costing you, right? What's the namespace collectively running up the bill to? And so that's kind of the idea of what I want to talk about today. And so how are you managing your Kubernetes? Is it one specific team? Is it a whole bunch of developers? And then how do we connect the dots? Those are the things that I want you all to start thinking about as you continue your journey. And if you're already there, that's great. If you're not, though, these are some things to think about. And so what we've done is we've kind of looked across our customer base, and we've come up with 5 different key questions to consider and hopefully answer as you go along this journey. Again, it's with cloud management as a whole, but today's talk really specifically around Kubernetes, because if you have been paying attention, that's kind of the theme in that I think Prashant referred to it as kind of next generation, and that's where things are going to, right? Like a lot of serverless, a lot of containerization is where we're seeing. Just a little bit about me, I've been with CloudHealth for about 6 years, so I've watched this trend definitely spike up into the right in terms of that kind of infrastructure. So the first one is, what are my costs per XYZ, right? And so apps teams usually have the ownership over developing and deploying the microservices. The Cloud Center of Excellence usually has to connect the dots. And so the first step is really establishing the reporting that's necessary, and also a little bit around what KPIs do you need to measure against, and how do you want to group your costs by, right? Is it by app? Is it by team? Is it by line of business? Is it by stage? Could it be by environment? These are all things that should be considered when you're looking at that. Now, for those of you familiar with Kubernetes, you might be saying, but Greg, how can we do this? Because this is not as easy as some of the standard infrastructure as a service through the cloud service providers. And that's part of where we step in, right? You can start looking at some of the reporting to say, do we want to see it by product A, product B, product C? And with CloudHealth, not to talk too much about us, I want to keep this a little bit more focused on, the general approach and a little bit less about us. But we have visibility, and some other providers may, in fact, give some visibility into what those costs are. So what this particular report is from CloudHealth is looking at the container cost history, and you can see we're categorizing through the Acme app. We're using a certain distribution rule, which basically allows you to gather costs related to cluster and divvy that up in a few different ways that we'll talk a little bit more about in the next coming slides. But the idea is to get an understanding of what each grouping is costing you. And that's kind of, bringing this back to say, well, what groupings do we use and are we consistent, right? So organizations might have different ideas. Different teams might name things different. You've likely seen this with tagging strategy or with naming conventions, right? What the cloud people name stuff or how they deploy stuff versus how on-prem, we've seen a difference there. But the takeaway here is, across your containers, your pods, your nodes, etc., how are you creating the boundaries? What boundaries are you using, and how do you need to report on them? So for very quick examples, how are you using cluster boundary? For team A, it might be by environment, right? We've got 4 of them. We've got dev, we've got production, we've got testing, and we've got DR. For team B, they might do it by project. And then what does the app label mean, right? For team A, it's project. For team B, it's the app. What other labels are you using, right? Are you using group? Are you using environment? Are you using team, project, house, right? Whoever's responsible for it, whatever labels you're using can also come into play here. And then how are you using the namespace? So you have a couple different elements. What we usually find, the most common ones are by cluster, by namespace, and then by 1 or 2 central labels that are usually, like a billing center or a cost code or some sort of team and departmental side. How you do it, obviously, is up to you. But depending on what you're trying to achieve, this is some of the questioning that your team should be having a conversation around. So basically define your clusters, define your boundaries, and make sure that there's consistency throughout your entire organization. Within CloudHealth itself, we can group Kubernetes costs by a couple different things. So basically we grab all the instance costs, the S3 buckets cost, and all the other associated services. We pull that in, and then we're able to group things such as by team. So you can see team A, team B, team C, etc. We could also do it by product. So product A, product B, product C, line of business is another one that we see often, application, and so on and so forth. So we have this construct of perspectives, which is basically just a way of grouping assets for business relevance. And that's going to allow you to group your costs and performance relations based on how you need to see it for your business. And it can be different from business A to business B, right? So you can view and report on cost and usage for each of these groups. And again, just the common ones are line of business, app or product, and by which team. So think about for yourselves. And if you have, spare paper and pen next to you, I might be dating myself on that one, or notepad or something like that open digitally. Maybe jot down 2 or 3 central key groupings that you may need to look at from a reporting and usage standpoint, just to keep track of. That would be my homework for you across today. So one of the other ways that we want to look at one of the key 5 questions is how should we distribute the costs? This is one of the biggest things that we see as a hurdle for finance teams, is really reconciling where does the money go and who should be doing chargeback, showback, shameback for it. So with resource requests, the advantage is that you're getting all of the costs, and it incentivizes your team to provision only what they need, right? Across actual usage, each team is only basically going to be paying for what they use. So anything that's not directly from them is going to go to either a shared resource, or it's going to kind of go to a collective bin. The challenges to some of this is that you're not using all the resources that are being requested. So you're saying, well, I'm asking for 10, but I'm only using 3. And so it can actually lead to people sometimes underspecifying what they actually need for requirements for that fear. The other thing is who pays for the rest? Who pays for the idle cycles? What can you do about over provisioning, right? If someone requests too much, again, that 10 widget capacity and they're only using 4 widgets, what do you do with the leftover? And it can also set an unrealistic expectation if you're doing it based on actual, of constantly having 100% utilization. So something to consider when you're looking at that is how do you want to distribute the worker node costing? And then what that usually looks like from a CloudHealth standpoint is we gather the costs by cluster, and then you can divvy that up based on namespace, based on pod label, and you can distribute that based on its memory and CPU utilization. Again, the way that we look at it is by requests. We've polled our customers across years, and more often they want to see the charges by request because that's what you're actually paying for. And then what ends up happening is who pays for the common services, right? Oftentimes organizations will have some sort of shared grouping. It might be a central IT, it might be some sort of microservice that spans departments or services more than one customer or client. How are you going to handle those common services? That's key question number 4. And so basically what we're trying to solve is this question here. Now, the 5th and most common question that we get is, what about optimization, right? So you've got the idea of, hey, we know that we need to pay for requests and we know that we can allocate costs this way. What happens when we encounter the realization that we're not using full capacity? We're requesting 10 widgets and we're only using 4. What do we do here? And so some elements that you can start to look at and start to dig into is, pod right sizing. You can look at auto scaling, right? So that way you're requesting less, but when you get a higher level of utilization, then you're scaling out. You can look at the node right sizing. So when you look at the node itself or the EC2 instance behind it, can you change the size of that? And then also discount terms, right? A lot of the different cloud providers offer some level of pricing discounting based on what you're actually utilizing. So spot instances, reserved instances, and that's true in across a couple different clouds. There's the committed use discount if you're using GKE over on Google Cloud, savings plans, what AWS has, which now covers their Fargate service, which is containers. So there are all these different discount terms that are coming out as well now that Kubernetes is becoming a lot more prevalent in the cloud provider as an actual service and actual bona fide deployment and infrastructure mechanism. They're starting to come out with more stuff that says, hey, you know what, use our services and you'll save money. Commit to this level of utilization or usage and we'll give you a discount there. So it's starting to operate a lot more like the standard infrastructure as a service, EC2 and VM, et cetera. And what's happening here is the ability to also offer some discounts in terms to reduce the cost, even if you're not right sizing. And then, ideally, you'd also be right sizing as you can. So think about some elements here. Your second piece of homework is, trying to make sure that you're comparing what's being requested versus what's actually being utilized, and seeing if you have some wiggle room there to perhaps lower the number of requests, or maybe you kick on something else to utilize a little bit more. And so to bring back the visual, want to talk a little bit about some of the customers that we've seen some success. And oftentimes there's a lot that can be done, early on in a container journey for customers, right? What ends up happening is before you can really fix anything, you need to be able to see it, right? Lord Kelvin once said, that which cannot be measured cannot be improved. And that's true of all of this. And so if we think about the first cornerstone of that cloud maturity, that's the visibility. Then you move into the optimization, then you move into the guardrailing and the automation of things, and then you move that in full integrations into other business services, and being able to build that into your KPIs. And we've been able to do that with Seren's 1010 data and Lacework. These were three key wins that we had, that we really were able to win because of that visibility and because of being able to tie actual dollar amounts of the Kubernetes infrastructure and containers infrastructure by application, by line of business, and all those things that we talked about. So, visibility is pretty key, specifically when you're first getting into that space, right? If everyone has been using on-prem, then the net new thing is, oh, we're going to move to cloud and we're going to do infrastructure. Then you start getting PaaS, and then you start getting, well, we're going to containerize, and now we're starting to go serverless as well. And you start microservicing a lot of your old monolithic apps, and you start using the newer technology. And that's when you start saying, well, okay, we're doing all this stuff and it's really cool, but how do we tie it back to the bigger picture? And that's my hope for what I've just talked about, is giving you some insight into how it fits in to that overall cloud center of excellence, and how it fits in to the overall organizational goals that you want to achieve in terms of tying back. Because you don't want it to be this black hole where you say, oh, it's great, we can make sure it's super secure, and we can automate it, and we can deploy it, and we can have these checks and balances for getting it into the cloud. But then once it goes into the cloud, people forget about it, and they just say, oh, well, we can maintain it from an operational standpoint, but we have no idea what it's costing us. We have no idea what the COGS is. We don't know what profit and loss is, because we can't see what each application is actually costing us. We can't see what each client is actually costing us. All we see is one giant bill, and we have no idea how it's divvied. So, CloudHealth can at least give you an itemized bill, if you will, and it usually comes right into play with chargeback, showback.